Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Eirik, welcome to my studio here in Florence, Italy. While today will be very similar to most other Thursdays, with a new video coming out like normal, there are some things that are different and will continue to be different for most videos heading forward into the future. If you're paying attention, you might have noticed that I've started making Patreon exclusive content, videos you'll only have access to if you are my patron on patreon.com. These videos come out once a month. I will continue to release free YouTube videos every week, but in cases like today, when I have 9 hours of footage to edit down, I will also release a longer version for my Patreon supporters. Essentially meaning that if you are my Patreon supporter, you will be getting more content than before. The Patreon version of what you are watching here on YouTube is over an hour long. But unlike the regular once-a-month Patreon exclusives, there will not be more narration than the regular YouTube version. So if you prefer watching me sculpt and not listening to me talk, you can become my patron for $5 or more and get over an hour-long video and not have to hear me speak. You can also turn off the sound, of course, but that's besides the point. These longer versions will only be made whenever I have time and there is footage to support it. I'm not committing to a schedule with these, but I expect about one video each month, I think, bringing the total of Patreon videos to 2 each month. Doubling the value, so if you were thinking of joining my Patreon but were on the fence, now is the time to strike. There's a link to the Patreon in the description below. For everyone else here on YouTube, you'll still get all the narration and a 24-minute video. Okay, with all the logistics out of the way, let's talk about what we will be doing here today. We are going to begin sculpting the third version of the Kronos maquette. As you can see, it's a bit bigger this time. It's 1/3 the scale of the finished sculpture, which will be 225 centimeters tall, or 7'4" if you are empirically inclined. And that makes this maquette right about 75 centimeters or 30 inches tall. This is important because I'm attempting to make adjustments to proportions in order to see if those adjustments will work. The idea is to adjust my model's proportions in order to make him seem taller and more slender. A seated figure with a regular length torso often seems short, squeezed down or midget-like, which is not what we're after in this case at all. We want him to seem really large and really intimidating. However, I do not know if my planned adjustments to the proportions are going to work, so I need to make a maquette that's large enough to where I can fairly easily and accurately measure out the adjustments I want to make. It's very difficult to be accurate when it comes to measuring in a tiny maquette. And with the design already settled on, I can work from life and adjust the proportions as planned without having to worry too much about where the arms go, where the legs go, etc. By the way, the procedure that I'm going through as far as sculpting this maquette is exactly the same as I outlined in my Patreon videos, which you can access by becoming my patron for $5 or more. And the same thing goes for the armature. There's an in-depth video detailing armature making on my Patreon page. Changing proportions brings up a bunch of potential issues, which we'll discuss after I tell you about what type of changes I am planning to make to the proportions. The final piece will be over life size, but the lengths will be increased more than the widths, but both will be increased to larger than life. And I'm doing this in order for the figure to appear slender and tall. The length of the torso will be increased even further than the other lengths in order for the most major part of the seated figure, which is the torso, that's what we can see most of in a seated figure, to appear dominant. This became an evident change that needed to happen when I realized where the pelvis would be placed in relationship to the pit of the neck. The distance between the two appeared to me to be quite short. And even though it was measured accurately, it didn't seem right. I observed this after I started and made the decision to drop the pelvis down a little bit, increasing the length of the torso. I made sure this measurement was recorded in order for it to be replicated in the over life-size version later on. Because I'm working from life and know the scale and size of my final figure, I can measure off my model, increase that measurement to the measurement needed on my final piece, and then shrink that measurement down by dividing it into thirds, bringing the scale of the figure you're watching me sculpt here to 1/3 the scale of the final piece. I'm trying my best here to work to, hopefully, accurate measurements, so you'll see me using the tape measure quite a bit to figure things out, making sure that the width of my pelvis is right, that the width of my shoulders is right, the height of the pit of the neck is right. I can't deviate too much from my measurements because this figure needs to accurately represent the proportions I'll be aiming to make and sculpt in the over life-size version. The changes that I've made is of course guesswork at this point. I don't know if my suggested changes are going to work out, which is the whole reason I'm exploring it in a smaller scale. Realizing that it wouldn't work in a huge sculpture would be both devastating emotionally and would require huge amounts of work to correct. The idea being that if you know where you're headed, it will be a little bit easier to get there. As I'm not working from nature to represent nature, but using nature to represent an idea, I think preparation is going to be key, because this is something I haven't really done before. And anytime you're wading into the unknown, it's good to do some tests beforehand to hopefully make the reach into the unknown as easy as possible. So what issues do I foresee cropping up while changing proportions all over the place? Well, the biggest one I'm nervous about is what will happen to my centerline once the height changes more than the width. Normally, I would line up bony points like the pit of the neck with another bony point, perhaps the ankle, or perhaps one of the aces points on the pelvis. And this would be part of giving my figure balance and the appropriate gesture. But if I keep the centerline true to my model's centerline and increase the height further than the widths on my sculpture, things won't line up properly anymore. Either I'll have to straighten out the centerline in order for the bony points to line up as they should on my model, or I'll have to allow them to not line up. And which one should I choose? I don't really know that yet. But my suspicion is that somewhere in the middle will be the correct answer to go for. If you have to make a hard choice, then compromising and going down the middle very often tends to work out pretty well in sculpture, or at least better than going to one or the other extreme. The other issue is a fairly simple one. Will things look completely out of whack when the proportions have been adjusted, or will the final piece resemble someone potentially real? I'm obviously not going to be properly representing my model anyways with this figure, but are the changes going to affect the believability of the figure itself, the final sculpture? And I don't know that either, so I have to figure that out. And that's why we're sculpting the maquette. Let's take a second to thank today's sponsors, my Patreon supporters on Patreon, who have ensured the continued existence of this channel and allowed me to upgrade my gear bit by bit, making better looking and better sounding content for all of you watching. If you are interested in supporting the channel, or perhaps interested in getting personal feedback on your sculptures from me, then Patreon is the place for you. You can get in-depth feedback on techniques and how you can apply them to your own work. Anything sculpture related goes. We can talk about armatures, supplies, mold making, anything you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So check it out, there's a link in the description below. And again, thank you so much to those of you who have given generously and supported me. It really means the world. At this stage, however, consider that I'm recording audio after this video has been recorded, of course, I feel fairly certain that the changes are going to work out well and not distort things too far. the female figure that Kronos is devouring will be accurately proportioned to a real model, and the plan is that the juxtaposition of the somewhat strangely proportioned Kronos versus the accurately proportioned female figure will further enhance his otherworldliness. Remember, I'm not thinking of this as a real scene, it's more of an image of a concept, of an idea, it's not the depiction of the act itself. So while it will be subtle and perhaps not the most obvious thing to most people, I hope that planting small seeds to sell this idea will be beneficial to the overall effect of the piece. Or that's the idea and the plan at least. We'll see how it goes, right? While you might not notice, because I can't show naked people on YouTube without getting demonetized apparently, even if I click the Not For Children button, the sculpture I'm making is more of an amalgamation of the previous maquette and my model, rather than a pure representation of my model. The tweaking of the proportions is part of this, of course, but there's also slight adjustments to the pose taking place here. I've made an extremely elaborate model stand for this project, but the pose is difficult to hold. A seated figure tends to sink together a little, and it's tough for my model to give me the lean forward that I'm after. My Kronos is to be depicted right at the moment before action potentially happens, so there needs to be a certain amount of tension in him. And this tension is not present when he's simply sitting on his butt. It's closer to a half sit rather than a full sit, and he's not quite standing either. So it's somewhere in the middle. And this is a tough pose for my model to hold, and while my model is the consummate professional, I do have to slightly deviate from what he is giving me in order to get what I'm after. This is not a huge problem really, as I've worked out the design I'm after in a previous maquette. Now that I'm working from life, I can take whatever my model provides me with that improves on the previous maquette, which was done from imagination, and add to it, while staying away from the things I believe do not add to what I'm after. In this sense, I am blending my own vision with nature. Will this work out or will it fail? That remains to be seen, of course. But there are some things I can do in order to make sure and increase my chances that this attempt will be successful. So what are those? Even though I'm not following nature here, deviating from my model in order for my sculpture to fit my vision and design, I can introduce elements that will keep the figure believable. If you've paid attention to the videos I make and have followed this channel for a while, you'll know what I'm talking about. It is structure. Notice that I introduce solid structure into the figure. I represent, for example, the front plane of the pelvis and the back plane of the pelvis, perpendicular to each other, giving me a solid pelvis bone from which all else springs. The twist in the ribcage is properly set up by making sure the front plane of the ribcage is clearly defined. In other words, the relationship between pelvis and ribcage, which are facing in two different directions, are set up at the beginning in order for me to attach forms to them and pull forms between them. Think of the big bony masses of the body as anchors. If they are structurally sound, everything else will fall into place around them a lot easier. Not easily, of course, but easier. Even with the proportions tweaked, my figure will appear solid. Perhaps not a properly real human being, but he will look like he has internal structures, bones holding him together, which in turn will make him look believable, like he could be alive. The centerline is drawn on there as well, and it is the same on the front and the back. The centerline represents the spine, and having the spine in two separate places gets us in trouble, of course. The two bottom corners of the ribcage are also placed so that they function with the front plane of the ribcage, making the ribcage a solid bony structure with symmetry. They need to be located across from each other on the same plane and slightly further back than the bottom of the sternum. Keep in mind that when we twist our bodies, one side of the ribcage partially disappears underneath flesh more than the other. This means that the corner of the ribcage which is visible on the extended side of the body, which is the left side of my maquette, might not have a matching corner on the right side of the body because the corner of the ribcage on the right side is buried underneath the flesh. At an early stage, however, I would still draw out the ribcage in order to make sure the left and the right side are symmetrical. Knowing, of course, that one side will eventually disappear underneath the flesh. This can be a good trick actually to ensure a solid ribcage, though not entirely necessary if you are good at creating structure. And so while it does slow me down a few minutes, I still tend to do it just to make sure everything lines up properly, though it is not strictly necessary. One thing that is necessary is that whenever we see a form attached to a bony mass on one side, it needs to be located on the other side. In most cases, there will be a form associated with the first one you found on one side, on the other side. There are exceptions to this rule, as explained above. Parts of the ribcage on one side here is buried underneath flesh, and so we will not have the exact same forms on both sides around the bottom corners of the ribcage. However, in order to sell this illusion properly, we need to make sure that when the ribcage finally appears from underneath the flesh on the right side, there are matching forms symmetrically across on the left side of the ribcage. This will play a huge part in selling the illusion that the bone dives underneath the flesh on one side. Another exception to this rule is around areas like the scapula, also known as the shoulder blades. Depending on the position of the arms, the scapula might be doing different things. These scapula are bones floating on top of the ribcage, and they can be brought forward, backwards, they can tilt, and they can do all of this independent of each other. I prefer in scenarios like this to deal with the scapula as two independent shapes. I begin with drawing them out first, and they should be of very similar size. Then I attach forms within the shapes of the scapula and to the shapes of the scapula. The shapes attached to the scapula might be deformed depending on the position of the scapula. The trapezius muscle is a good example of this. If the arm stretches forward, the scapula moves forward over the ribcage, increasing the distance between the spine and the scapula, which increases the distance the trapezius fills up as it is attached to both spine on the inside and the scapula on the outside. The trapezius muscle is stretched thinner in this case and appears flatter, which we do actually have happening on this sculpture with the right arm, which is extending forward. We also have the other scenario present on this sculpture, and that is the arm being pulled back, which brings the scapula closer to the spine, shrinking the space the trapezius muscle occupies, which makes the muscle bunch up and appear thicker and fuller. And this kind of outlines how I go about sculpture on a very basic level. By creating solid bony structures first, I can then pull muscles and forms between their attachment points fairly easily. If the arm on one side is pulled back, the chest muscle on that side becomes extended and stretched thin, while the trapezius muscle on the back becomes contracted and full. So in a way, this sounds simple, right? But of course, it's a lot harder in practice. The millimeters matter a lot when doing these sorts of things, so very, very small drawing mistakes will add up, and if you're not willing to adjust, you'll end up with a bad end result. If you know where the muscles attach, more or less, you can stretch the muscle between the 2 points it attaches to. Now, this is not a rock-solid solution in every scenario, of course, but it helps. If the bones the muscles attach to are not too far out of whack, you'll get a decent result at least. There's a lot more to sculpture, of course, but at this stage, I find that simplifying things a little really help to avoid getting overwhelmed. Personally, I don't know every single muscle attachment and insertion point. I don't know all the names of all the muscles. But I do know a decent chunk of anatomy, however, and that helps a lot. And being able to spot individual forms is the most important thing, I think. With the bones placed well, you can have a lot of random shapes and forms between them, and it will still appear somewhat real if anchored properly to the bony structures. Many forms that I observe corresponds with the muscles of the body, but a lot of times you get forms that do not properly line up the way that you would imagine. You'll find when working from life that many things are very similar model to model. Of course, we are all made after the same blueprint, but there are many things that are different as well from model to model. People have different muscle mass in different places. There is buildup of fat in different places on different people, and you'll find an almost infinite variety. Working from life provides this variety by default. It's there right in front of you. Working from knowledge of anatomy tends to leave you with a less varied and slightly more boring end result. But it all starts with having good structure. And if you're a beginner watching this, that's the thing you should take away from this video. Good structure is the basis of good sculpture. Every good sculpture has it, but good structure alone doesn't make a good sculpture. Like a musician who has mastered tempo. On its own, tempo won't make a good song, but every good song needs tempo. If you enjoyed the video and want to learn sculpture, check out my Patreon page. I give feedback and critiques on people's work, and we talk about whatever you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. The process you are watching is a lot closer to my actual process than what you'll see in my educational videos on Patreon. There I'm trying to more clearly define each step in order for it to be possible to follow along, in order for it not to be too confusing. Here I'm a little bit all over the place, I bounce around a bit more, and it's all a bit more organic. But if you want a clearly defined, easy to follow process, you can check out my exclusive sculpting content on my Patreon page. The first series we have already started embarking on is the beginner's guide to sculpting the figure. I'm super excited to finally be creating exclusive content for Patreon, and I hope you will be too, and we'll take a look. The link to my Patreon page is in the description below. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for a new video next Thursday. Hit the subscribe button and the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you enjoyed the video, click the like button and share it with your friends and family. It helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.